Hey everyone, and welcome. So, when you think about the early Turkic peoples, what comes to mind? Probably nomadic warriors, right? Riding across the vast steppe. But what if that's only half the story? What if one of those groups, the Uyghurs, built an incredible legacy, not just on fighting, but on culture, diplomacy, and building cities? Today, we're going to dig into that forgotten history and bust the myth that settling down means you've lost your edge. Let's get right into it.
Okay, first things first. We've got to tackle a really common cliché. It's this simple story about the Uyghurs that a lot of us probably heard in school, but honestly, it misses all the best parts.
So here's the big question we're going to tear apart. Is it true? Did the Uyghurs just wake up one day and decide to completely ditch their nomadic warrior traditions, just instantly change who they were?
Wow. I mean, that's a really powerful statement from historian Başak Kuzakçı. And it tells you right away just how off-base that common story really is. The whole idea of a sudden, overnight transformation, it just doesn't add up when you look at the evidence.
So this is the cliché in a nutshell, right? The Uyghurs were the first Turkic state to settle down, and because of that, they lost their warrior spirit. They got soft. It's a neat and tidy little story, but it's a massive misunderstanding of how, and more importantly, why they evolved.
So, let's peel back the layers and look at the real story of settled life in this part of the world. Because, you know what? The story of cities in Central Asia, it starts way, way before the Uyghurs show up.
And boom, here's the key. This is what changes the entire timeline. The Uyghurs were not the first, not by a long shot. From earlier empires like the Shengnu all the way to the powerful Gokturk Khaganate right before them, Turkic peoples had been building cities and towns for centuries. They were never just 100% nomadic.
And this right here, just perfectly illustrates the point. A Byzantine envoy named Zamarchihos travels all the way to the Gokturk court. And what does he write about? He's not describing some simple tent camp. No, he's talking about a court with palaces and luxuries that he says were basically just like what he was used to back home in Byzantium. This is proof that a really sophisticated, settled culture was already there.
Okay, so if they weren't the first, then why are the Uyghurs the ones we always associate with settling down? What was so different about their situation that it caused this massive, large-scale shift towards city life for pretty much everyone?
Well, the thing is, it wasn't a cultural whim. It was a strategy, plain and simple. First, they already had a foundation of cities to build on. Then came the trigger. The old Gokturk Empire was falling apart, and the Uyghurs jumped on that opportunity, with a little help from China's Tang dynasty. But the real motivation? It was all about money. You just can't tax a population that's always on the move. So the state needed a stable tax base, farms, livestock, you name it. The result was a statewide policy to encourage everyone to settle down.
Our source material has the perfect analogy for this. Think about the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. We often learn that's when Turks first came to Anatolia. But actually, they've been trickling in for decades. Manzikert just opened the floodgates for a mass migration. It's the same thing with the Uyghurs. They didn't invent settled life for the Turks, they just kicked off the first mass shift to it as official government policy.
Okay, so that brings us to the next point, where we take down that other part of the myth, the idea that settling down made them weak. No way. The Uyghurs didn't get weaker, they just completely changed how they used their power.
I mean, just look at this comparison. It shows a total pivot in how to run a state. The Gokturks before them, their whole model was based on military raids and forcing China to pay them tribute. The Uyghurs, they took a completely different path. They built a long-term alliance with China, even sending their own troops to help put down rebellions. And instead of just demanding silk, they basically said, hey, how about we become business partners and sell this stuff together? They went from a state built on conquest to one built on economic and diplomatic muscle.
And what happens when you create that kind of stability and that kind of wealth? Well, you get a cultural explosion. It totally transformed the region and turned Uyghur lands into the absolute cultural heart of Central Asia. With peace and trade booming, their cities, especially oasis cities like Turpan, became these vibrant, buzzing, multicultural hubs. They were true melting pots where ideas, goods, and people from all over the known world came together. I mean, just look at this list of who was living there. In one Uyghur city in the 9th century, you could run into Koreans, Japanese, Tibetans, Chinese, other Turks, and even Sogdians, who were like the master merchant diplomats of the Silk Road. Can you just imagine the incredible conversations, the art, the philosophy, the science being exchanged on those streets every single day?
But here's the thing. They weren't just a crossroads where ideas passed through. They were innovators. And this is really wild. The Uyghurs were pioneers in paper and printing technology. They developed it to a super high level even before it became a huge thing in China. That makes them creators, not just carriers of culture.
This number is just mind-blowing. 11,000. That's how many manuscripts written in the Uyghur language are sitting in just one collection today, the Berlin Turfan collection. Just let that sink in. We're talking about beautifully decorated calligraphic texts that prove they had this massive literary and artistic world. This is the hard evidence of their golden age.
So if the Uyghurs were this important, this innovative, this powerful, what happened? Why is so much of this amazing legacy pretty much forgotten by most of us?
Well, here's a crucial part of the puzzle. The Uyghur story doesn't just end with their own empire. In fact, they were one of the very first groups to willingly join up with Genghis Khan as his empire started to rise. And he didn't treat them like a conquered people at all. He saw them as partners. And because they were so advanced culturally and knew how to run a state, he even called them princes of the Mongols.
And this timeline just lays it all out perfectly. You can literally trace how their influence spread. See, the Mongols were a nomadic military powerhouse, but they didn't have the systems needed to run a huge empire. So what did they do? They adopted Uyghur models for everything: writing, diplomacy, administration. Uyghurs became teachers for the Mongol princes. So as the Mongol Empire got bigger and bigger, it carried this Uyghur cultural DNA with it all across Asia, into Persia and Anatolia, influencing later empires like the Ilkhanates, and through them, other Turkic states down the line.
And that brings us right back to this quote from the beginning. It's such a great reminder that the Uyghur story isn't just a one-off thing. This strategic shift from pure military power to cultural and economic influence is a pattern we see again and again throughout history as empires figure out how to adapt and survive. Which leaves us with this final, really important question. Why did this incredible civilization, which was basically the cultural engine for the biggest land empire in history, become just a footnote? You know, maybe it's because their influence was so successful that it just got completely absorbed by the Mongols and became part of their story instead of its own. Or maybe it's because the history books tend to focus on the warriors, not the administrators who actually made the empire's work. Whatever the reason, it's a huge reminder that history isn't just about what happened, it's about who gets to tell the story. Thanks for joining me.